I think about when I first started reading Marx, it was in a German philosophy class my freshman year of college, and which was the exact same 2008 that the banking system was exploding, and we were reading the German ideology, and I'm like, oh, this seems kind of relevant. At that moment, I didn't think I knew how relevant. We're in the fourth boom, you call it, of Marx in America.
Yeah, that's right. So I've tracked these different periods in American history when lots and lots of people in the US have read Marx favorably. And there have been four periods. The first Gilded Age, mostly read by people who were building the socialist and sort of militant labor movements during that time period. Then what I would consider the biggest Marx boom, the 1930s. It goes without saying, probably, that that would be a time period that Marx would be appealing to people because of the crisis of capitalism, the Great Depression, and also because there was this large, vibrant communist party and communist movement during the 1930s. And then the third Marx boom was the 1960s, when lots of the young student radicals and other various offshoots of the New Left movement were reading Marx in various ways, in part as resistance to the war in Vietnam, and in part because lots of young people in the US and really elsewhere around the Western world were feeling alienated from the capitalist political system. And then I'd make the case that we're in our fourth Marx boom period, and that it really did start in 2008 with the financial collapse. And you know, it's more difficult to track this now than in the previous eras, not only because we're living through it. As a historian, it's always easier to understand things in retrospect, but also because there's not the same kind of like close connection between people reading it and a movement per se. Lots of people turn to Marx, even mainstream writers, in the aftermath of the crisis, because for so many people it seemed so unprecedented in 2008. Lots of old school Marxists like David Harvey, Terry Eagleton, Eric Hobs Bomb came out with books about Marx in the years following the 2008 financial collapse, probably because they felt that we were having another Marx moment and they wanted to have their say about their favorite philosopher. But even ever since then, we've seen a growing number of books, writings about Marx that I think we can potentially connect up with millennial socialism, the growth of DSA, the Bernie Sanders campaign. But it's hard to say where it's going. But there have been, I would say in the past 5 years, I've read like 15 to 20 books published about Karl Marx, mostly for an American or a Western audience, published in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think that's pretty remarkable, and it says something about where we are and where we're going. What exactly? I think that's up for debate.
Right. Yeah. And, it's funny you say that, because a book that this one reminded me of is Hobs Bomb's How to Change the World, which I just double checked to make sure this is true. He talks about meeting George Soros, and Soros being interested in thinking like, I need to learn some things about capital from Karl Marx in this moment.
Yeah, there's so many instances, like recently, but also throughout the time period I cover in the book, going back to the Civil War, where you'd be surprised who was reading Marx, and not just to disprove him, although there's lots and lots of that. This is the US, after all, the most anti-communist nation in world history. But just people, like one recent example is there was an article in the New Yorker by the economics reporter John Cassidy in 1999, and he said in the article he talks about how he was having a conversation with one of his Wall Street friends or contacts, and that person was saying, I don't like where things are going, and I think everybody needs to start reading Marx. 1999, right? So there's a lot of that. It's, Marx just continues.
Yeah. So let's rewind all the way to the start of the story, and where, like you said, Marx during the Civil War. What's important to emphasize about Marx? His writing in the New York Tribune. Was it what would you like people to know?
Well, I think lots of people will find it interesting, fascinating, and probably a surprise that Marx wrote for the New York Tribune for about 9 or 10 years during the 1850s. It was his main source of income during that time period. The New York Tribune was the most widely read newspaper in the world during the 1850s. All good Republicans read the New York Tribune. And Marx was the main European correspondent for the New York Tribune during that time period. So even though the articles were usually published without attribution to author, kind of like The Economist has always done. Like, it's undoubtedly true that, for example, Abraham Lincoln was reading all kinds of articles by Karl Marx, even if he didn't know his name. And I just find that fascinating. It's kind of like the largest body of Marx's published writings. And so this kept him attuned to what was happening in the United States. That and the fact that he had so many friends and comrades who had emigrated to the United States after the failed 1848 revolution. These are known as the 48ers. Many of them, once the U.S. went to war with the secessionist Confederacy, joined the Union Army, often on the Western Front along the Mississippi from St. Louis on south. And they were radical abolitionists who were trying to make the war about abolition. And Marx was in constant contact with them during the war. The New York Tribune fired... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, you talk about Marx's conception of slavery. Can you just outline that relationship between that and capitalism?
Yes, indeed. So he wrote tons about the Civil War during the war, especially in the early years, both for public consumption and in private letters. He hated slavery as an immoral abomination, but also believed that there would never be socialism, there would never be an effective labor movement or a movement for the power of the working class as long as part of the working class was enslaved or enchained. And so his opposition to slavery, his support for the Union Army was both rooted in like a moral take on his anti-slavery stance, but also it was rooted in a strategy, and that is, we're never going to be able to build a socialist movement when people are enslaved. And thus, at the end of the Civil War, he expected with the abolition of slavery, there'd be a flowering of labor movements. And to some extent, that did happen.
And it's fascinating in the years following the Civil War. We've had Mark Kruger on to talk about the St. Louis Commune of 1877 and all the rail labor actions. Talk about that, but also talk about like how Marx became known and in which communities he was known in. Particularly, you talk about German immigrant communities and sort of what his reputation was, because you say like the idea that a guy who had these ideas was writing for the Herald became kind of scary to folks in that 1870s Red Scare.
Yeah, right. So other than amongst the, I guess what you would call the communist movements in Europe, that kind of coalesced around the First International, which Marx was a part of, an important part of, or they were known as the International Working Men's Association. Other than in those circles and amongst his German emigre friends who were kind of living in a 48er diaspora, Marx wasn't very well known up until the 1870s. But by the 1870s, many of his works began getting translated into several languages, including into a little bit into English. But there's this large, vibrant German socialist culture in cities like New York and Cincinnati and Milwaukee. And they're all reading Marx, usually in serialized form in many of their journals. They become very familiar with Marx's work, especially with aspects of Capital. Maybe they didn't sit down and read the whole book, but they had read excerpts of it, especially the famous chapter on the working day. And so he had become known in those contexts. But then increasingly in the 1870s, probably in a sort of like reaction to this, a dialectical effect, lots of conservatives, or even what we might consider liberals, begun to pay attention to Marx. And beginning with the Paris Commune of 1871, even though Marx had nothing to do with it, he was oftentimes blamed, or his ideas were blamed for the Paris Commune. And this begins a pattern that persists to this day, and that is when anything that conservatives, reactionaries, and even some liberals find scary, they blame Marx or Marxism or Marxist ideas. And that was certainly true of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which the St. Louis Commune was a part of. There were members of the International who were partaking in that failed experiment, but Marx's ideas were in the mix, I guess you might say. Marx had nothing to do with it, but he was indeed often blamed by reactionaries in like many of these mini Red Scares that predated big red scares of the 20th century.
Yeah, and sort of the Gilded Age is sort of bookended by two of those early Red Scares. We've talked about the one in the 19 teens through the perspective of like the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota. One thing I was less aware of, and I'm sure David had heard of this, but the Oklahoma Socialists or Marxists. Can you talk about them a little bit?
Yeah, right. So this is something like when I'm teaching my students about socialism in U.S. history, I always ask them, which state do you think had the most number of socialists who were members of the Socialist Party of America prior to World War I? Not knowing much, they usually say New York, maybe California or something, but it was Oklahoma. There was a huge Socialist Party in Oklahoma, and for a short time, it was like the rival party to the Democratic Party in Oklahoma, composed mostly of former populists, like people who were part of the prairie radicalism of the People's Party in the late 19th century. So these were largely like small farmers, tenant farmers who, capitalism had done them wrong and had been doing them wrong for a long time. And when populism fell apart, they were looking for an alternative mechanism or party to go to, and they often found the Socialist Party. And in that context, even though there were lots of socialists who were of a more European Marxist bent in places like Milwaukee and New York, they grew the party and they compelled the party to adjust its policies with regards to land and agrarian reform in some interesting ways that like later Marxist parties in places like Cuba and China would do similarly.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. So we have the Red Scare sort of around World War One, and of course the Bolshevik Revolution, which is the huge event. And it's fascinating that you mentioned 10 years later you would see another boom of Marxism. The 20s being a sort of a fallow period because of rising, I guess. I mean, this is when Sinclair Lewis writes about Babbitt and the sort of materialistic businessman. Can you just talk about that period, like where we're hearing about certain people are inspired by the stories of the Bolshevik Revolution, but there's another class of folks who is getting very alarmed by it.
Yeah. The 20s would be like, I guess, a bust period. So the 20s were a pretty conservative period in U.S. history. Historians have compared it to like the 1980s and 90s in terms of there being culture wars. You see the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan. Nativism is pretty extreme. Anti-Catholicism. We get the most restrictive anti-immigration laws in U.S. history. And capital is reigning supreme in the 1920s in ways it hadn't, I guess, maybe since before the progressive period. The presidents during the time period are all very pro-business Republicans. And a lot of this was made possible by political repression of the first Red Scare. Thousands of leftists, Marxists, anarchists, various communists and socialists are deported to the Soviet Union, 1919. Lots of people are arrested, jailed, including Eugene Debs, of course, for opposing World War I. There's plenty of instances of leftists being lynched, including prominent Wobblies. In fact, the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, is completely crushed during World War I and after. The federal government and especially state governments had long wanted to accomplish that, and they used the tools, the machinery of the state that was provided to them by the war and the Red Scare to do so. You see a lot of racial repression in response to riots, race riots in places like Chicago. It's just, it's a bad time for the left. And interestingly, the left did not help itself because, at least as I argue in the book, they were so enamored by the Bolshevik Revolution, understandably so, that the Socialist Party basically fell apart because they couldn't agree about how to organize in response to the Bolshevik Revolution. And you get the formation of a couple of different communist parties that come together, and their approach is to go underground or be secretive. Like their approach to political repression is, we're just going to go underground, maybe the way the Bolsheviks did in the years prior to that, to the Russian Revolution. And I just don't think that will ever succeed in an American setting. So they didn't have much success during the 90s, and really it took the Great Depression for and a change of tactics for them to start to have success.
Yeah, and so we enter the, I guess, well, you have the World War II, and we enter the Cold War. And so you talk about liberalism's relationship with Marxism and sort of like the anxiety it has about it over the course of those decades?
Yeah, sure. So, as I said, during the 1930s, one of these boom periods, like everyone's reading Marx, writing about Marx, and everyone, I mean, like activists, intellectuals, lots of politicians, people involved in the labor movement, people involved in any kind of political movement. The left sees a real heyday, but even lots of people who might consider themselves liberals under the FDR umbrella, as part of a larger popular front, are associating with communists and reading Marx. Early in the Cold War, really by the time you get to U.S. entry into World War II, lots of these people start to rethink this association with communism, and as a result, they are rethinking Marx, such that by the early Cold War, so the late 40s and 1950s, American liberalism, it's the intellectuals, the Cold War intellectuals, as you might call them, they coalesce around what they call the American political tradition, what some of them call the liberal tradition. It's an invented tradition that these Cold War liberals invented, but hugely important to inventing this tradition is their negative reading of Marx. So all of these people ranging from, not even like a Cold War liberal like Isaiah Berlin in London, ranging to Edmund Wilson, to Arthur Schlesinger, to Walt Rostow. The list goes on. Reinhold Niebuhr. They're all reading Marx. They're writing about Marx. They're taking him seriously in the many books and articles they write during this time period, but as a way to define an American political tradition as anti-Marxist. And their basic thing is liberalism defeated fascism. Liberalism will defeat Marxism or communism. Liberalism is the superior political mode of existence in modernity. Liberalism is the end of history. That's kind of the whole approach they take. And so it's almost like they had to perform an exorcism of Marx in order to vivify this liberalism that they thought was like going to take the world by storm.
It doesn't seem like they really did liberalism defeat fascism. I feel like there's a lot of communists that also might have done that. But then you get all this language about like the end of ideology and stuff too, which even drives me crazy to this day. Like, I don't want to bring the abundance agenda into this, but to hear certain types of mistakes or errors of analysis be made and accepted, like, well, I guess we didn't know that Republicans were gumming up the works on that. Well, maybe there's an ideological reason certain mistakes get made, that maybe it's not just the Marxists that have ideology. Maybe there's some other ideologies at play too.
Yeah, it's always in retrospect, it seems to me, that those who proclaim to be anti-ideologues are the most ideological, because one of the most ideological things you can do is say that your ideas represent truth, objectivity, or something that is just grounded in empirical reality, when in fact it's very clear, historically speaking, that liberalism was an ideology every bit as much as any other, including Marxism or fascism. And when I was, I had a kind of fun time reading all of these books written by liberals during the 40s and 50s, because they kept proclaiming that the thing that had proved Marxism wrong was liberalism, was the New Deal, right? Because specifically the New Deal had achieved what Marxism said was unachievable, and that is, within capitalism, the working class had, at least in the US and some European countries, the working class had achieved like an existence that wasn't precarious. And my response to that was always like, just wait. But also that such was made possible, as you said, by large communist movements in various places that either helped build the social welfare states or served as a counterexample against which liberals had to respond, which is Eric Hobsbawm's historical argument for the social welfare states that were built up in the 20th.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that is tied to the rate the economy was growing, as a sort of historical circumstance, as much as enlightened liberalism.
And frankly, imperialism, which lots of people in the 1960s recognized with the war in Vietnam, and why lots of, the 1960s is kind of a curious time when for there to be a boom in Marx in the US because the economy was doing so well, relatively speaking, for so many people. And yet a growing number of people are recognizing not only that they just, okay, the economy's doing well, but I just feel like this is a bunch of bullshit, feeling alienated from the system, feeling like they have no say over their lives, but also, even more so, the Vietnam War, US imperialism, there was a reckoning and there were connections being made between imperialism and I guess the prosperity that so many Americans were participating in or enjoying.
Yeah, that kind of those connections being drawn, how much of that would you say was Marxism saying, our issues here are similar to issues of that have helicopters flying over Vietnam and dropping bombs?
So, there was a Marxist argument for this going back to Capital and his analysis of primitive accumulation, and that is that capitalism was predicated on the conquest of various parts of the world. There had been lots of Marxists since Marx who had analyzed imperialism in light of capitalism, including Lenin and including some pretty interesting American theorists. During the 1960s, Harry Magdoff, one of the writers and editors of Monthly Review, wrote extensively about this in connection with Vietnam. So there was lots of Marxist thought about it. I don't think you had to be a Marxist to make the connection, but the connection had been made pretty explicitly by Marx and those who followed in his footsteps.
Right, because like MLK, you wouldn't call him a Marxist. He made that connection, although he was conversant with folks who perhaps would have been. Let's turn finally to, let's talk about this financial crisis thing here. And I mean, how would you characterize, I have a vague memory of the pre-global financial crisis, but I'll be honest, it's really when I started paying attention to news and stuff. So how would you describe the sunny days before the financial crisis as it pertains to Marxism?
So I can speak to this because I'm, as I describe in chapter 9 of my book, sort of a Gen X Marxist, and there aren't very many of us. So like during the period between the 60s and then after the financial crisis, there's still a lot of people reading and writing about Marx, but it's usually almost often in an academic setting. Marx had become a theorist that people in the humanities and social sciences read. Some people took seriously in those settings, but lots of people just read Marx alongside all of the other sort of like canonical thinkers. There wasn't really an organized political left that sort of oriented itself towards Marx during this time period. So like, for example, I first became sort of cognizant of myself as a leftist in the late 90s, especially after the Seattle WTO protests, and felt like I was a part of the anti-globalization movement, went to a couple of protests, including one in DC. Like you can think about the sort of way in which people analyzed it as kind of like loosely Marxist, but I don't remember a lot of people saying we have to sit down and read Marx to understand this at the time. I don't think that was happening. You might have thought that the way in which the US government responded to September 11th by launching a global war on terror, specifically in Iraq, which many protesters said was, the basic refrain of the anti-war movement in 2003. And I was at some of those protests, including the big one in DC, was no blood for oil. There's a kind of like pseudo-Marxist analysis to be made there. And there were always some Marxists making these arguments in very Marxist terms, but very much sort of sidelined or marginalized. It's really not until the 2008 financial collapse that you see the sort of emergence of a democratic socialist left that I think is taking its Marx seriously again. You can kind of see this organized around, so Occupy Wall Street, not exactly Marxist, but I do think it inspired a lot of people to think about what it might mean to resist capitalism, and that brought a lot of people into Marxist circles. And you see the growing emergence of like Marx reading groups, coalescing around the popularity of journals like Jacobin and others. And then you see the sort of rise of podcasts and just lots of people who might be loosely categorizing themselves as Marxists or reading Marxist literature. And I think this flowers even more with the Bernie Sanders campaign from 2015 on, and the emergence of DSA as I guess the rebirth of DSA as a party mechanism for millennial socialism.
Yeah, and one of those podcasts, you mentioned David Harvey's reading of Capital, and I can still remember walking around Manhattan. Obama was president. I was like waiting to hear jobs report numbers, and it's like, well, maybe just stick on us and David Harvey. And it's interesting to see how many. Do you have any idea of rough numbers of people who are engaging with Marx? Because like you said, it's probably easier to track subscriptions and stuff, or circulation in old days versus now. You have people getting like YouTube, TikTok. Like, how would you even start to do that?
I don't even know how you would do it in any sort of quantitative form now. There have been critics of the notion that Marx ever had influence in the US who have run engrams and have noted that, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, there were no Americans reading Marx because there were no books published about Marx. But that's not entirely accurate because of the sort of vibrant socialist pamphleteering culture, and also because there were lots of books that were written through a lens of Marx, and they often didn't use the word Marx or the word communism or whatever because they were trying to convince Americans who were kind of loath to these terms and ideas. But yeah, how do you measure it now? I don't know if there's a sort of accurate way to do that. I do know that I think hundreds of thousands of people have downloaded David Harvey's podcasts in which he teaches Capital. That's pretty remarkable. In fact, there's this long history of people in the United States trying to sort of like teach or translate Marx, or especially Capital, for a broader audience. So many examples I detail in the book. David Harvey is probably one of the most successful such people. I think I make the case that he's probably taught more Americans how to read Capital than any other person in this long history of Marx reception. So I think you can get a sense also from book sales. This is a weird one to me, but on Amazon in the days after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the Communist Manifesto and Volume 1 of Capital were both like selling like hotcakes. To me, it was weird because you can get the Communist Manifesto for free online, even then on Marxist.org. But I guess people wanted a hard copy and wanted to buy the thing. But, at the same time, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged was selling like hotcakes in that moment. So people were looking for alternatives, various alternatives.
It's fascinating to me to think of like a actual capitalist reading the parts of Capital about like making pins or something like that. And be like, did you not know this?
Yeah.
You hadn't thought this stuff through before? But
I know.
Yeah.
More example of the power of ideology.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. I would want to read what Marx is saying if he's coming for me like that. But Andrew Hartman, the book is Marx in America. I can't recommend it more. It's out now, is it?
It is, yes, yeah.
There, we'll put a link to that. Just out now for folks. 600 pages. It's well worth it for folks looking for. You mentioned the Robin Blackburn book on Lincoln and Marx, and this is that's a good book. It's got a good introduction and some good speeches and writings. But this is sort of what I was hoping that book was, to be frank. A really good encyclopedic history. Congratulations on the book, Andrew.